authors with different skill sets working together. This means not only including research commissions, but understanding the best way to collaborate with them by understanding their perspectives and expertise. The next speaker is our first clinical keynote. He is not a statistician. He's a very well-known cardiology researcher. He's the head of the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation at Yale, where clinicians and statisticians collaborate to assess healthcare quality, evaluate clinical decisions, and compare the effectiveness of specific healthcare interventions with the goal of improving health and healthcare. He's an outspoken advocate for patient access to medical records and making medical data that can be open widely available. He's a founding member of a patient-centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was established as part of the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act. He has a regular blog on Forbes.com and has contributed to the New York Times Wellness blog, the New York Times op-ed page, and National Public Radio Shots blog. Please welcome Harlan Krumholz.
So that's the first time I was introduced as, he's not a statistician. But that means you shouldn't expect that much from me. I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to be here for several reasons. One is, I believe that you and people like you are going to play such an important and fundamental role in the future of healthcare and medicine. And so I wanted to have a chance to talk to you. Second, I run the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation. We're about 150 people that sit at the intersection of the university and the healthcare system. We work to try to apply data science so that we can improve healthcare. We're interested in being able to reveal things that people can't see. I tell our group that our work is a form of social engineering. We're trying to make visible what's invisible. And we're trying to elicit actions that will help people who have no voice, who can't perceive the quality in the healthcare system, or can't perceive the lack of options and choices, and don't really understand the ways in which the healthcare system works. And so can we be their voice and channel what they need in order to try to help improve the healthcare system through better flow of information, better understanding what we can learn from the healthcare interactions. And so we're always hiring, just to say, if anyone wants to reach out, we're always hiring. We're always looking for people like you. I think that it's interesting to have a conference on R. When we started out, and our group is still predominantly using SAS, in part because CMS, we do a lot of work with government, we do a lot of work with healthcare systems, we're doing a lot of work with China, we're sort of local, national, international, but a lot of people we work with want to be able to use standard packages. We distribute SAS packs when we do work with CMS, but I can tell you our group is moving in very fundamental ways towards R and Python, I would say, in terms of programming languages, and as we sort of look to the future, where things are evolving. So anyway, I think it's good that you all are together and focusing on improving your skills in this area. So I know it's too hard to go through disclosures. Feel free to take a picture. I don't have anything I think that really conflicts with what I'll say today. So first and foremost, I want to say that our work together, our work to try to make things better in healthcare, has to always be driven by a singular idea, that there are people out there in need, and that if we can work hard and make contributions, that people we may never meet, their lives will be better because of the work that we've done. And so it's always through the times when you have to be persistent, and when it's frustrating, and when you're not making the progress that you want to make. You always have to come back to, if I'm successful, what's the result? And the result is that people are depending on you. They may never know you, but they're depending on you in order to be able to make the contributions that will ultimately make a difference. I'm going to focus on this a little bit later too, which gets to the question of whether you're doing important enough work, which is why I titled this Dream Crazy. I'm going to get to that at the end, which is about the Nike commercial. But are you dreaming big enough? Are you aspiring to make a big enough impact? Can you see in yourself the ability to do work that will really matter and be able to stream into a situation like this and make a difference for people? So my basic premise is that the current research enterprise is inadequate to keep up with the information needs of patients, clinicians, health system regulators, and others. We're ignorant. When we're in medicine, when we're making choices, either at a high level around policy or at a fundamental ground level with patients, we're most commonly making it with a substantial amount of uncertainty. And uncertainty because we're uninformed about this particular situation. What's likely to be the trade-offs? What's this person's risk? What might be their response? What are their options? And we generated a knowledge generation enterprise that was largely based on large randomized clinical trials, which was an advance because doing experiments and being able to use the power of randomization gave us an ability to dampen or even eliminate the issues of confounding. But it also meant that these studies went on, they were large and cumbersome and expensive, and in the end they were built to give you an average effect. I mean, even when people do subgroup analyses, they're all underpowered because the trial is built for a singular answer based on enrolling enough people in order to test a singular hypothesis. There may be lots of secondary hypotheses and, like I said, subgroups. But it's not just that you've got multiple comparisons, you've actually got underpowered subgroups. So the conclusion that there's no heterogeneity is often a foregone conclusion, especially if you start looking at particular subgroups, making it almost impossible to get to a point of true precision estimates for individuals, except that you have to assume the effect is equal across everyone. And now your only precision estimates are by making differential estimates of risk and then making inferences about differences in absolute benefit or even harm based on that, but with the assumption that the effect is the same because you aren't able to mount enough evidence to the contrary. And so as a result, every time we look, for example, the guidelines in cardiology, more than half of the recommendations are actually without an evidence base, not even that there's a trial. And then only about 20%, I think it was 22% were built on large trials. But I'm telling you, even the large trial evidence is inadequate. And so it's not truly serving what we need. And similarly, I say that the current research enterprise is inadequate to produce better outcomes for each patient at a rapid speed and an affordable cost. The directionality of the research was often not particularly focused on what people care about, which is what's the best outcome for me, and can you give me new information faster if we need it, and also I need to be able to afford this. So you have to still understand the context. It doesn't matter just what is the best thing to do, but the how is it delivered, how is it possible, how is it accessible to people becomes equally important, because if we know what to do but we don't know how, or the how is blocked, people can't afford it, we have a big problem. And in the United States, I saw recent statistics that half the people in the nation don't have $400 in cash to handle an immediate emergency. This was written in response to thinking about weather emergencies, but they have to put it on a credit card. I mean, we have to appreciate what the situation, the circumstance of regular people are in this country, and what does that mean when healthcare becomes an issue. So how are we generating knowledge to eliminate waste, to help people understand what their options are and how they can best use the medical care system as it exists, and how can we improve the medical care system. So my metaphor for this is we're in a drought. I mean, every once in a while something springs up that's good and worthwhile, but the truth is, I believe it's a crisis. I mean, it's not that there are not a lot of articles being published, but the vast majority of the articles being published aren't directly germane to helping people make choices. And in the area, if you think about in the clinical domain, if any of your family members need medical care, you'll see that almost all the decisions are conjecture. Even around common conditions like high blood pressure, the choice on which pill, what target, I mean, we're still arguing about all these things. For what person? For the person in front of me, how do we begin to even think? There's lots of choices. We have a lot of information about high blood pressure, but really helping people make a specific choice for them that's the best choice, we've been at quite, I believe, in darkness to a large extent. So the way we do things has created a choke point to progress. I mean, we've sort of have built a lumbering system, even the grants, so you've got a really good idea. How many months do you think it will be before you're actually funded to start that project? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you have a good idea today. By the time now you've got to put the grant together, meet the next deadline, NIH will push it back to you because just for hazing, they want you to go through 2 cycles. And you're talking about almost 2 years before you start a project that may take you 2 years. that will produce something that's not going to come out for 5 years. And then, another issue that I've been railing against is well, we can talk about the publications issue too, which is, because we're not using preprint servers to a large extent in clinical medicine, you're at now further delays by peer-reviewed publication. We actually are going to stand up a preprint server in clinical medicine this fall with Cold Spring Harbor and BMJ. Cold Spring Harbor puts out bioRxiv. They've had a lot of good experience in the life sciences. So we're going to put out medRxiv and try to start encouraging people to use it. I say, in your world and in a world that we work in core around machine learning and AI, in that part of our work, if you just depended on published literature, you'd be so far behind the field that you would never catch up. You have to depend on conferences and preprints and communications that are outside the peer review. Now, peer review still has a function, but then the question is in medicine, should we really be doing it the old way? So I just want to share with you a few ideas that they're not necessarily new, but I want to just give you a little bit of an angle on. So the first one is a very basic one that you know. But, digital data is the new it. We are fundamentally in a different era now than we even were a very short time ago. And I don't believe the world has quite caught up to this. And, but others have. But in medicine, we're slow to it. You in this room are very much tuned into it. But you couldn't be in a more exciting era in medicine. And I say medicine is firmly emerging as an information science. And, the medical curriculum, they don't quite realize it. They still think it's, they want to... I'm not going to argue against teaching biochemistry and the way that things are being taught. But the truth is, people need to know how to handle information. They need to know how to be able to assess it. They need to know how to help generate it. Some of them need to know how to analyze it, but they need to know how to judge it. And they'll need to know how it's filtered, because no one's able to keep up with the amount of information and data that will be and is already out in the ether. Much of it, like I said, not very useful, but how doctors need to be trained to understand information in ways that wasn't true even a decade ago. And yet, like I said, we are still very much practicing medicine as we did in 1950 and 1960. The actual workflow, the way that people think about things. I mean that there even still are textbooks in the traditional sense. But there, of course, is knowledge that's not changing very quickly, that could be codified in the form of a textbook, but it's shrinking. The truth is that what you can, by the time you produce a book in medicine, it should be out of date. And so, how do you teach? How do you filter? What do you depend on? All these things are very important. And, particularly now, and that's what I just said for you guys, that there could be no better time to be where you are. The digital transformation has now occurred between computational analytic advances, some of which you're talking about here, and mobile devices and sensors. It's the golden age of what medicine will be, and it will, I believe, not resemble very much like it has. What it has been is that I sit as a repository of knowledge and experience over the course of my career, and people come to me. And they come to me, and our experience is sequestered between us, and the more gray hair I have and the more years I practice, the wiser I am, and I try to read and keep up. But, people come to me. In an information world where it's an information science, we go to them. We go where people live. People have a rash, they take a picture of it. They don't even need to see a dermatologist. They're getting an interpretation. People want to talk to 3 doctors, they can talk to 3 doctors. They don't have to go and wait in line, give up the whole afternoon. And the information isn't every doctor holding a different information. There begins to be a collective wisdom that's emerging within that can help make individual decisions at the point of care. It doesn't take out the importance of the clinician, but the clinician's role changes. The clinician's role is an interpreter, a coach, a guide, someone who's helping understand what those options are. They're not a shaman who says, this is what you should do. You should go to bed for 3 weeks, and every different person making a different assessment. But we're going to be funneling things together in a collective wisdom. And I just put this up because it still amazes me to think about this. So, in 2008, the actual penetration of electronic health records in this country is quite low. This digital transformation in medicine is only less than a decade old in terms of, showing the adoption within electronic health records. And this means you guys are the pioneers. I mean, you know, you're the ones going to the moon. You guys are the ones, this is your time. Like, how is it that you can be born at a moment where all of a sudden everything changes, and yet nobody knows how to make anything of that change? It's sort of like Van Leeuwenhoek invents the microscope, and everyone starts saying, well, hell, we should start looking at stuff. You know, it's actually, you can see things you never saw before. That this is the prospect of where we stand now. That all of a sudden, you know, all of this would have had to be hand acquired before, but now it's sitting in digital format, albeit messy, fragmented, difficult digital format, but it still has been a tremendous push. And meanwhile, this is just to show, I don't know if you can see it, but it's what the cost of a computing power equal to an iPad 2 was. So 1940 was like $1 trillion, but you know, $1 billion in ENIAC. But you know, now the costs of storage, the cost of computation. We have a data lake with a new server network that gives us, with the parallel computing, just about supercomputer capability. We buy DGX1, we have a bunch of GPUs, and we're off to the races. I mean, we're competitive with anyone. It's not like we had to wait till some donor gave us $100 million to create a big building that was going to house our computer networks between the cloud and what we can do locally and the access to data. It's not the impediment that it would once have been. So, you know, between the computing power, the digital universe, and I think we're still on the cusp of what wearable technologies are going to be in sensors. You know, we're not going to be constrained with information that's acquired in intermittent clinical encounters, but we will be collecting information about people's lives with their permission, I hope. That is going to help paint a larger picture of their activity, their function, their quality of life. And what will that mean? That will mean not only will it save us time, but it'll be more accurate. It'll help us assess the impact of our interventions to a much greater extent. Because if someone's got a wearable that's testing their sleep, and you come in and you say, well, we just did this to try to improve your sleep, how is it? They can report it, but we can also look at some objective data about what it looks like. If we're collecting information about their symptoms by streaming to their mobile device a question once a day, just a simple question, even we don't have to worry that their recall isn't good enough to tell us exactly what was their symptoms like. Or if someone's limited their activity so they no longer have symptoms. In my field, someone who may get chest pain with activity sometimes stops walking upstairs or walking up an incline. They restrict their activity. You ask them, are you having symptoms? They'll say no. But if you ask them, are you changing your life? Often they'll say no. But the truth is, if you get very specific, well, what did you used to do, and are you still doing it? Well, a good clinician can elicit that. But the wearables should be able to give us a lot of that information too. I think what I want you guys to think about as you're going to kind of this next era is, you know, the changing nature of the way in which data have been collected and used. So, you know, I think this idea of moving from static to dynamic learning systems, smarter with every interaction, is going to be a key idea for the future. Which is, it's not that we go out by brute force and create a static data set that we lock and then we analyze. But instead, data is accumulating, it's streaming. But this idea of learning with every interaction is sort of, you know, borrowing from, you know, some of these ideas from the tech companies. You know, I say, like, Amazon doesn't lock a database and then deep dive into it. They're learning with every click. They're getting smarter with every click. They've got it set up so that with every interaction, there's some new knowledge that can be generated. Again, contrast this with traditional medicine, which is I'm sequestered. You and I have an interaction. There's no way for anyone else to learn what happened unless I want to write it up. I may talk to someone in the hallway, but there's no way to create collective wisdom. But this is what the tech companies have done. They said, we are going to have the collective wisdom based on the experience of everyone in the system. And then, to the extent that we can identify you, and they can identify you, they're able to develop a lot of knowledge about what you're likely to do. To the extent that Amazon has a patent on shipping you something before you even buy it. Because they can be, at some point, very high confidence that you're going to make a purchase. And I don't know that they're ever going to do that, but it shows the fact that they put in for this patent shows that they are thinking ahead with predictive analytics in a way. And so what I'm trying to do is push an idea that data generated every day for a variety of practical purposes can serve as an inexhaustible source of knowledge to fuel a learning healthcare system. I wrote an article in Health Affairs about the era of big data, if anyone's interested in looking it up. And this was the idea that I put out. I said, we need to be able to create collective wisdom from the interactions. And actually, as Michael said, I'm very interested in giving people agency over their data and trying to create a virtuous community of people, particularly with common conditions, who are willing, through a governance, to have their data used by people who are trying to learn from it in virtuous ways that might then put them in a position where the people who are a mile behind them are going to be better off for having learned about what happened to these people, and eventually everyone knows that they're better off because of the people who are a mile ahead. And how do you build the governance for that? How do you build the structures for that? But ultimately, it will be about saying every interaction should teach us something, and the very next person who comes should be able to be in a better position because of people who went through it. Right now, somebody has a glioblastoma, they have a brain cancer, they're treated. At Yale, we'll talk about it, but at another place, they may never learn about what happened, and people are treated off-label. Everybody's treated in a slightly different way, and there's no collective wisdom that's generated. And the idea here is that, well, for every condition, we ought to be able to do that. One thing I want to say also about this, we'll see what you think about this, but I say the case report form's dead. Long live all the data and the streaming data. So this is, again, our traditional approach. I do a lot of work with the American College of Cardiology, a terrific organization who are pioneers in putting together the very best registries and have the largest numbers and the longest track record in this. I've been part of this effort, but I want to just say to you that, so this is an example of a typical case report form. I know it's hard to read, so I'll just tell you. So this is a particular one for patients with heart attacks. So what we're doing now, by the way, still, is a human being is going into the digital record and manually abstracting structured fields in order to then have that inputted, or they sometimes can use electronic data capture, input that into digital format. But by the way, what we're doing is taking high-dimensional data and now we're making it low-dimensional. We're creating a very low-dimensional database in a very manual brute force. So by the way, the hospital's spending hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on nurses or other health professionals to do it this way. But look what some of these variables are. This is state of the art. This is the best heart attack registry in the world. Honestly, it is. Hypertension, yes, no. Dyslipidemia, yes, no. Cancer, yes, no. If yes, solid or hematologic. Prior heart attack, yes, no. Prior heart failure, yes, no. I mean, you can imagine how those variables are obscuring the richness of histories. So that means I can put a bunch of people in this corner who have the same responses to all those, and I guarantee you any clinician that goes and looks at them is going to go, oh my goodness, these are entirely different people. Now, how do I mean that? Well, the difference between someone who had hypertension diagnosed and diet controlled and was barely elevated and has never been a problem versus someone whose blood pressure has been routinely 180, is on 5 medications and has difficulty being controlled. Someone, prior history of heart attack, someone had a heart attack 20 years ago, we're not even sure about the diagnosis, but it still persists in the chart, versus someone who's had 5 heart attacks in the last year and seems to be escalating in some sort of syndrome that people can't even describe. And in one case may have a heavy burden of coronary disease, in another case may actually have no coronary disease. There are other syndromes with no fixed coronary disease where people can have heart attacks. We've completely made it almost impossible to identify an individual. On a global level, it still works. Why? Because on average, someone who's had a history of a heart attack is worse than someone who on average has not had a history of a heart attack. But the heterogeneity among the people who have yes to a dichotomous variable around have you had a history of a heart attack is mind-blowing. But this is our state of the art of what we're doing. And what I propose to you is that this should be antiquated. It should be an anachronism. I mean, it shouldn't exist anymore. Not that it even takes the brute force and effort to do it, but it should be something that we should be able to dispense with. Because it is not useful. I mean, we can create risk models that have scores that function reasonably well with a large population. it should be no surprise to you that it does. Like I said, on average, people who have these conditions, if you say yes to cancer, on average, you would prefer to be in the group that said no to cancer, right? I mean, that's the group you want membership in. That group's got a lower risk on average, but it tells you very little about the patient in front of you who had a history of cancer, because the coefficient associated with cancer is a real mixture of different types of cancer in different scenarios and different situations. Almost to be meaningless. So on the no side, it probably, it doesn't hurt you so much, but on the yes side, it doesn't tell you anything. So in the world of an EHR, and for all its limitations, there's a wide range of other things that are possible. So, this leads to this other idea, which is heterogeneity is in. It's all about the heterogeneity now. How can we understand, in a precision medicine world, how can we understand what your risk is, what your likely response is? And in order to do that, we need to know a lot more than we have traditionally known. And so then we have to figure out ways to be able to move from the assumption that everybody is actually pretty much the same, which seems to me to be implausible. I mean, if you basically say that if you look at the trials and the assumption is no heterogeneity, this drug, this intervention, this device, this procedure has about the same effect on everyone, which is what most trials conclude, in part because they're underpowered for the subgroups. It seems implausible. I mean, how can that be true? And yet that's sort of what we carry forward to the guidelines and what people teach in medical school and the hospitals, and when the next patient comes in, we'll quote numbers that are based on that. There's another piece I want to try out on you. I will tell you, when I first started talking about this, I got pummeled on Twitter. By the way, feel free to tweet any of the stuff I'm saying. Be very complimentary. But I got pummeled on Twitter about this because a lot, especially Frank Harrell at Vanderbilt. Yeah. Thank you. I feel at home here now. Frank's very traditional, and I don't think he understood even what I was talking about. Not that he's not smart, but let me try it out on you. I don't think that there's missing data. The old days, we're trying to fill in the case report form, and anything that's missing is a problem. We got to figure out how we're going to do it. We're going to impute it. What are we going to do with the missing? And but that's because we've got a structure. We're trying to create a certain idea of a complete data set that's static and going to be done. But in this new world, I think there's no missing data. People just have different amounts of data. And so if I'm trying to predict, for example, who's going to have acute kidney injury in response to receiving contrast from a coronary angiogram, and I've got two people. You just are new to me, and I just have your baseline information from you coming in because you're from somewhere else, and because of the craziness for our healthcare system, it's hard for me to get your old data. And somebody else has been in the Yale healthcare system for 10 years. And for that person, I've got 100 measurements over time. And for the other person, I've got just one measurement because that's the first time they've got the measurement. Now, I can create a case report form that says, what's your highest creatinine on record? But, I mean, that's what we would usually do. What's your any history of chronic kidney disease? Instead, what we could do is, why wouldn't I want to take advantage of all the information? In the one case, I only have one. In the other case, I've got 100, which there's a lot of metadata there, too. Like if somebody had a certain period where they were measured frequently, but then otherwise they weren't measured very much, that's metadata. That probably means carrying some information. And what were the values? And not just what was the highest value in the last 5 years, but what does it look like? What were the trajectories? And there's just a lot to learn from the patterns of that data. And I believe that instead of thinking about everybody's got to have the same data, we've got to figure out how we leverage all the data that each person has. And what are the kind of things we've got to develop in order to help us do that? And that's a different construct than thinking about what percent missing do you have. Well, that's if you have that variable, what's your highest creatinine in the last 5 years, you've got to say, did someone fill in that field? And it's a very different idea. And I sort of say that, there's about, in this idea, it's all about feature engineering. So, you've got to get the raw data, you clean it. But this is all going to be about what new features can we create? Do we vectorize the 100, whatever your past history is, to create a representation of you that can then ultimately be compared to representations of other people? And again, going back to Amazon, I mean, they don't say, you know, you've been on for 5 years, but we have a lot of people that have only been on for a month, so we only look at a month so we can create a common data set every day at the end of the day that we log and say this was the data set we have for today. They have systems in place, like all these other companies, that are leveraging the ability to take advantage of all the data you're willing to give them. I mean, why would you waste any of it unless we can prove that it's useless and that we wouldn't use it? But not because by definition we're saying everyone's got to have the same. The notion of missing data is that we need to make sure that everyone has the same data set, or else, you know, we can't. We have limitations, right? And it's just a different idea. I don't know, Frank, like I said, beat me up and others, but I think it's not that controversial. Now, I do want to say something to you that it's not all about the analysis. Just for humility, you know, we can come up with the best strategic approaches on the analysis, but in the end, the data matter too. You know, and an example of that to me is our frustration in creating good models for readmission. You know, our group has worked for a long time on this idea of people go home from the hospital and about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 end up coming back within 30 days. And, you know, we tried to say, well, okay, can we stratify the risk? Can we figure out, we can predict mortality really well. We can't predict this readmission very well. By the way, challenge to anyone in the room. That's a good problem to think about. But I believe part of it is because we don't have the data we need. In other words, the data that we traditionally have around their clinical care neglects information about did they get rest in the hospital? Were they well nourished? Are they stronger when they leave because of the environment? Were they disrupted? Did they have a place to go? Did they have an appointment set up? What was the transitional care? How were the coordination and collaboration and communication effectuated? We can't measure that very well. All those things, what was the quality of the care? We don't measure that very well. So no matter what we do with the data, if we're missing fundamental things, and if we don't have other data that can somehow be proxies for that data, or create some ability to understand them as latent variables, then we've got a problem. And that's I think also happens. The other thing is, and I'll just show you this, which is, well, you know what this is. How many classes did you take on interpreting this, by the way? I mean, are you certified in reading this? Okay. So this is my point just about, we often make things difficult in medicine, whereas, I love weather maps because, everyone in America can understand a weather map, but yet they actually take high-dimensional information from complex data that's coming from millions of sensors run by supercomputers with advanced algorithms, and yet they deliver the information to the public in a way that in 2 seconds, everyone knows exactly what it means. And, it's geospatial, this shows the type of precipitation, the intensity. I know that they've been so successful when my mother, who was in Florida, was talking to me about, well, did you see the European model or the US model for where the hurricane's going to go? And, it's like, wow. I mean, I don't know how deeply she understands that, but she knows that there are two calculations. She can look at the uncertainty by looking at the cone. She can look at the time for where is it going to be when. And I'm just saying to you that somebody's put some thought into, I don't need sophisticated PhDs to be able to read this output. And where's that in medicine? So this is another feature of this, which is we got to get the right data, we do the right analytics. How are we going to deliver what we need? So I just, in this last part, I want to just say to you, to signal this part, which is, I think the right question may be the hardest step, which is, it's great you guys are honing your skills, but the collaborative part where we really define what is it we're actually trying to answer, what are we trying to do, ends up becoming one of, I think, the singular most important thing. And there was an article I recommended to you that was in Harvard Business Review by the CEO of Incentive. And you guys know about Incentive, and they run things like Kaggle, and all those folks run this, where many of you may participate, but they'll actually pay you if you solve a problem for it. And some of the problems are small and some of the problems are big, but they're very good at developing problems. That's their business model. A company will say, we've got a problem we want to solve, and they want to crowdsource it, so they'll go out and people will pay. But so this guy put this together, and I thought it was worth lingering on it for a second. So eager to start working on solutions to innovation challenges, companies often don't spend enough time and resources on defining the problems they're trying to crack and establishing their importance to the organization. The result are missed opportunities, wasted resources, and initiatives that are out of sync with strategy. Well, he's talking and thinking about big corporations, but I think this has a lot of relevance to what we do. And, he sort of sets this up. I'm not going to get in so far in the weeds, but a little bit, which he says, can you establish the need for the solution, justify that need, contextualize the problem, and then write a problem statement? And so the establish the need for a solution is, the purpose of the step is to articulate the problem in the simplest possible terms. We're looking for X in order to achieve Z as measured by W. My point for us is, when we're trying to solve a problem, you at least need to be thinking a couple steps ahead. If I'm successful, if our team is successful, so what? So what? What happens? How can we express that in the simplest terms as sort of an elevator pitch? So you could say, this is what we're trying to do. I can't tell you how many times there's a disconnect between even the team's understanding of what they're trying to do, let alone a timeout to say, is this worth our time? Where is this going? What is it going to do as a result of our efforts? The justifying the need is to explain why you should be doing this. So what's the advantage of your? So if you may have identified an important question, but then the question is, are you well positioned to do it? What do you need? Do you have the skills? Are you ready to be able to do it? I think contextualizing it means who else has worked on it. I've too often seen too light a dive into the prior literature to understand what other people have done. And by the way, if no one has attacked this problem before, you have to ask the question, why? Is it because you're so smart? Or is it because other people have just felt it wasn't important enough? I mean, what's the reason if you can't find others having cracked this? What are the issues? And then really writing it out as a problem statement, a full description of the problem, and captures what's been learned, why you should do it, and so that everyone on the team has a very good common understanding. This sounds very rudimentary, but I can tell you it's often the wasted time and effort is because people aren't aligned in understanding what they're trying to solve. I like this Einstein quote, if I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I'd spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. And this one, there are no right answers to wrong questions. You can spend a lot of time. I will tell you that I think the problem areas for us to focus on in medicine are around prediction, effectiveness, safety, pattern recognition, discovery, and mechanism. And like I said, I believe it's the most exciting time ever. On my mind, though, are issues about how we validate what we're doing, how we continue to update if it's streaming. The interpretability and issues around causation are critically important, and you can see Pearl writing about it in the Book of Why is in the book. I really urge you to dig into thinking about these issues about interpretability and how we communicate. I've talked a little bit about that already. And so ultimately about how do we make sure our work helps people? How do we make sure it's leading to something of importance? What's the interface? How is it interfacing with other people who are going to do something with this? And what's our accountability for what we do? Because everything we do has a potential for harms. It has always the information has potential for harm. So there's a lot of hype. People want to talk about AI or talk about analytics. I believe it's something like this. We're still at Kitty Hawk, but the distance between Kitty Hawk and passenger flight was actually not very long. And I think in our world, we are still at an early phase. No one's cracked it. I haven't seen any killer apps really enter medicine in this field. I mean, there's lots of people nibbling around the edges, but we have yet to really make fundamental advances that are going to be felt on the front lines, but we're close. I think the idea is how we can capture this. I was going to get back to this. I'm not going to play it, but I urge you to see the Nike thing. It's inspiring. There's a political feature to it. We'll put that aside for a second, but the whole message is, are you dreaming big enough? And are your aspirations audacious enough? And are you brave enough? And I want to say to you guys, this is the greatest time. You should have great aspirations for yourself, for your teams, for what you can accomplish. And you should be pushing yourself, not just to do the work in front of you every day, but to be thinking hard. And I want you to be thinking statisticians, not just doing the analysis someone's handing you, but being a participating team member who's helping push forward what's possible. because your ideas are funneling forward, and you're always challenging the conventional wisdom and asking what's possible. Helping us move from this era, and where we're just praying for rain, hoping things are going to change, to one where we have a bountiful harvest, because we've created pathways for knowledge generation that didn't exist. And so I'm leaving you with, time moves differently for people with progressive, debilitating, or life-threatening disease, people facing health challenges. We always have to keep this in our mind. They're depending on us to spend our time wisely so that they can be helped in the end. And it ultimately comes back to this, can we do the work that can be meaningfully felt by the people who are in most need? Thank you very much.
Maybe two questions.
Yeah, just a bit. Good. I mean, he sounds a lot
So
like
I'm a
Glenn.
huge fan of different amounts of
I mean, it's
data.
just general
As a
outlook.
clinician, I know that if they're not full of blood gases, the kids probably not in respiratory failure. I also was wondering about when they discuss in the chapel last week, there were a bunch of labs in the past and nothing recently that's really different than coming on service in 10 labs in a week. So what sort of progress is being made in models that can handle this kind of input, and what families of these are going to be able to handle this sort of information?
Well, I think it's a good question, and again, getting back to the questions I have are, in what circumstances does knowing the past matter? About 20 years, there was a trial that was measuring ejection fraction every 6 months, how the heart ejects blood, and we were using very rudimentary approaches at that point, but that's a question we asked, and it turned out only the latest mattered, according to the methods we were using. Now, I still believe that history must have mattered, but we weren't, I don't think, sophisticated enough to try to figure out how to actually do that. I mean, I leave it to you guys to think how these models are, but I think we ought to be experimenting on a lot of different approaches to figure out how best to do that. I mean, again, for me, it also should be there are different domains of information that can flow from it, some from the metadata, some from the data itself. But the representations of that person based on that information are, I think, a central challenge. And I mean, it's for me to collaborate with people like you to figure out how can we extract that knowledge. So I think it's a good thing for you guys to come up with what you want to test. But I think what's important is to say, how can that information be used in meaningful ways? And then how can we be testing? Who does it matter in?
So you convinced me completely.
You're in the right field.
So I'm a mid-level data analyst in a team of Frank-Merrill evangelists. How do I help my team move forward and engage with some of the things that you present?
Come join us. Well, I think that part of our job is to open people's minds to different approaches and to start talking about what's possible and to start dreaming. That's why I said, are you dreaming big enough? So that ad is called Dream Great. So, how do you start saying that we should feel discomfort with traditional methods? By the way, traditional methods have served us well. I'm not suggesting abandoning them. But I'm just saying we should also be thinking about innovating and what's possible for the future. So, and we're constantly testing ourselves. I also think we can be automating a lot of these tests so that in sharing code and accelerating. I mean, the beautiful thing about this community is it's one that works together very well. I mean, people are sharing all the time. And I believe progress, first of all, I think it's a wonderful example for the rest of the scientific community, particularly in clinical medicine, where people are sequestering things and often just trying to get individual credit and not trying to share. I mean, in this community, it's all about sharing. And if people have got good code, then letting the next person build on top of that code. And so I hope in the end, better ways will win. That people can just add more horses to the wagon train, but when they see the cars zipping by, they'll say, maybe we should try some of that. But, we need to have respect for different points of view and different people doing things in the field. But what I hope this group will become are innovators who will be driven by trying to come up with new approaches that really leverage the new opportunities that exist in front of us. And again, that we're accountable, we're testing. We want to make sure we don't cause harm inadvertently by trying to implement systems that we intended to be better. But the possibilities, I believe, are endless.
Thanks.
Thank you.